Okay, so Socrates suggests that now it's time to look for justice, and at first he kind of suggests that Adimantus should ask Glaucon and Polemarchus and all the others, and they should find it. And Glaucon breaks in and says, "Nonsense! You said that you would help us find it. You said you would help us find it, Socrates. You yourself said that it wouldn't be pious for you to be, allow justice to be criticized. So you have to help too." Socrates says, "Okay, I will." So he says, basically, if the city has been correctly founded, then he says at 427e, it must be perfectly good. Therefore, it will have what the four cardinal virtues in ancient Greece. The four cardinal virtues: courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. Socrates says it will have all four of these virtues. Therefore, even if they have trouble finding justice at first, if they can find the other three, whatever is left will be justice. Now, of course, you might say, well, there's some, you can maybe object to this procedure in some ways. One thing, of course, it's sort of assuming here that justice is good, that it's a virtue, and in some ways that was supposed to be what the whole conversation was supposed to prove. Is justice good? It was supposed to show that, not assume it as it does here at the end, trying to find justice. Well, it must be one of the virtues. It must be whatever's left over, although, again, in some ways, maybe this will answer the concerns of Glaucon and Adimantus. But they come to the end. This is how they're going to try to find it. And so Socrates is looking, and the first thing he sees, the easiest thing he finds, is wisdom. He says wisdom is sort of knowledge. It's a kind of a skill. It resides in the guardians. It resides in the ruling part of the city. And so therefore he says, not in any other members of the city. He says, wisdom is what you use to rule. Therefore only the rulers would have it. And so he says, therefore wisdom resides in the smallest part of the city. So only a very small part of the city is wise. Again, just the part that rules, the rulers. It's in their knowledge and their skill in ruling. That's what the wisdom is. And so it's concentrated only in the class of the rulers, and therefore in the smallest part of the city. So they establish that's wisdom in the city. Then they move on to courage. And again, Socrates says courage resides only in the warriors. And so 429a. And so, if a blacksmith is working in a shop and a fire breaks out, and the blacksmith is courageous in putting out the fire, Socrates says that doesn't matter. That's not courage in the city. He says courage will exist only in the part of the city that fights to defend the city, that takes the field for it. So he says only in the warriors will we find courage, or only in the warriors does the city's courage really exist. And so he says, and he's really, when he talks about the courage, he doesn't even focus so much in overcoming fear or facing danger or fighting well or anything like that. Obviously what he says is related, but he says courage consists in that part, the warrior class, having in it a power that through everything will preserve the opinion about which things are terrible, that they are the same ones and of the same sort as those the lawgiver transmitted in the education. This is at 429b to c. So again, he says courage in this city, in the part of the warrior class, is a kind of power that will enable it to preserve the opinion about which things are terrible and which are not. So, if you think back to the earlier criticism of Achilles in Book 3, Achilles, by most accounts, very brave, not afraid of death, a great warrior. But Socrates sort of, as we might expect from the criticism of Achilles' courage here in this city consists much more in, again, preserving the lawmakers' opinions, the opinions about what is terrible, what is not. For instance, that slavery is more terrible than death, one of the concerns they had in Book 3. It's preserving this opinion that Socrates really focuses on as courage. So he says, a courageous man is like a piece of cloth that's been dyed, and it retains the dye no matter what. Whether it's washed with lye, with other harsh things, with things that would normally remove dye, if somebody is courageous, then they're able to preserve that opinion, just like a cloth that can preserve dye. And so he says, and he also mentions, again, pleasures. He says, pleasures as well, pain, but also pleasure. You need to be able to preserve the proper opinion through all of that. And so there's obviously a lot of focus on opinion, and towards the end of this discussion, Glaucon says, so the courage of beasts and of slaves, he refers to that as the right opinion about these things that comes to be without education. So he says, so he sort of indicates, look, sometimes slaves, for instance, who are not citizens, they might be brave, though. They might have something you can clearly see as courage. In fact, in some cases, slaves may even end up fighting for the city under certain circumstances. They're not citizens. They haven't been educated to be this way, and yet they possess something that it's very hard to deny as courage. And he says, and even more animals. Beasts. A dog If a dog sees someone, if we go back to the idea that Socrates has dogs loyal to the people that they know, if they see someone they know, being mauled by a bear or something, then the dog might attack the bear. Ordinarily, if the dog is just out in the woods and it sees a bear, it will run away. It's not that the dog doesn't understand that the bear is dangerous, but it will attack the bear to try to help somebody that it sees being attacked if it feels a sense of loyalty to that person. And you might say again, well, if that's not courage, if a dog attacking a bear, if that's not courageous, then what is it? What is it? Again, it's not ignorance. It's not that the dog doesn't understand that the bear is dangerous, but it's attacking the bear to try to help the person. So Glaucon, again, all this focus on the opinion kind of comes out here. He says, well, so when they have the right opinion about these things, but without education, you would say, well, that's not really the right kind of courage. So again, he kind of indicates, look, there are other types of courage. There's a type of courage that even animals have that's very hard to say, well, if they have the right opinion about what is terrible and what is not, much less that they have the opinion through education and so on. So in any case, Socrates says that's right, and he says, and Glaucon says, so this is courage, and Socrates says, well, let's call it political courage. And he says, if you want, later we'll give it a finer treatment. He says that at 430c. It's a little unclear what that means. It could mean that maybe he's thinking about a philosophic kind of courage, kind of a finer treatment in the sense that there's a finer kind of courage that they'll discuss, or again, maybe he just means we'll give it a fuller, a more complete treatment of the sort that they give it in Plato's Laches, which is the dialogue about courage, where they discuss this other type, the fact that animals can be courageous, that they say this isn't simply courage, that they can't kind of be satisfied with this as the definition of courage, but they say in many cases, part of what courage is seems to be a kind of non-rational disposition, a kind of fearlessness that doesn't necessarily have to do with opinions or being rational or anything like that. So in any case, for present purposes, in this discussion, they say the city's courage resides solely in the warriors, and it consists in their preserving the right opinion about what is terrible and what is not. So then they move on, so they've identified wisdom and courage, and they move on to moderation. Socrates says that moderation is, as he puts it, more like a kind of accord and harmony than the previous ones at 430e. And what he means by that is that, as he goes on to say, moderation exists in the entire city. Moderation exists in the right kind of accord and harmony in the city. So he talks about different ways that you can be better or worse than yourself. He says that doesn't make sense. What they mean is that there's a better part of someone and a worse part, and when the better part rules, then that's when they're moderate. So he says, moderation is surely a kind of order and mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires at 430e. He mentions pains later. So the city's virtue in the case of moderation is a matter of the better few ruling the many who are less good. So he sort of, again, he comes back to the idea that the really good are the rulers in the city, but that they're relatively few. So as he puts it, the desires in the common many are mastered by the desires and the prudence in the more decent few. And these more decent few are the ones, as he says right before this, the ones born with the best natures and best educated. So this is at 431c to d. So he says, the desires in the common many, the mass of citizens have their own desires which are not necessarily good, but they're mastered by the desires and the prudence in the more decent few, and the rulers, the ones who are born with the best natures, get the best education. So moderation then is when the desires of the city as a whole are ruled correctly, and that means when, again, the desires of the many are mastered and kind of governed by the desires and the prudence of the rulers, the decent few. But again, since moderation involves the many kind of submitting to this rule, it involves the entire city. So again, moderation exists in both the rulers and the ruled, he says, at 431d to e, and thus stretches throughout the whole 431e to 432a. So again, moderation kind of stretches throughout the city. And so he says at the end of this discussion, so we would quite rightly claim that this unanimity is moderation, an accord of worse and better according to nature, as to which must rule in the city and in each one. So again, he says that there's an agreement or an accord in the city of both the worse and the better. So even those who have lesser desires accept that the better should rule. And again, he stresses according to nature. So this sort of this arrangement, this arrangement of rule is based on nature. And he says that moderation in the city is this unanimity, this agreement of who should rule and who should obey, and which desires and whose sense of prudence should rule and who should not. So he says that's moderation in the city. So then finally they come to justice, and they say, so where is it? It must be whatever's left. We still can't find it. There's a little bit of almost kind of a playful sort of, where is it? They're trying to find it. They're looking around. And so basically they come back to establish it. Socrates comes back to the idea, as he puts it here, each one must practice one of the functions in the city, that one for which his nature made him naturally most fit, at 433a. So again, they come back to the idea of, one man, one job, and again, in particular, the one man will be practicing the one job for which he's naturally most fit. And that's the first thing that they identify with justice. That's the way that they that's the way that they kind of come back and find justice. And so he says that since what's left at this point, when they look at the city, they've established the wisdom, the moderation, the courage. What's left at this point is the citizens' habit of minding their own business and doing their job. So he says this must be justice. And so, but it's more than just that. It's more than just the fact that that's what's left, although that's kind of what he says at first. At 433b, he says, well then, my friend, I said, this, the practice of minding one's own business, when it comes into being in a certain way, is probably justice. Do you know how I infer this? No, he said, tell me. In my opinion, I said, after having considered moderation, courage, and prudence, this is what's left over in the city. So first of all, this is all that's left, is the fact that everybody's minding their own business, doing their one job. But he says, then he goes on to say, it provided the power by which all these others came into being. So it's sort of the power by which all of these other things were able to happen. And once having come into being, it provides them with preservation as long as it's in the city. And yet we were saying that justice would be what's left over from the three if we found them. So it's not just some quirk about the city that's left over, it's also sort of the condition of these other things happening. The fact that the rulers can rule, that the warriors are courageous and maintain the right opinion, the fact that the city is moderate and the city as a whole accepts who should rule and who shouldn't. He says all of these things are ultimately based on the fact that each citizen kind of focuses on doing their own job. And so justice is sort of the condition of all of these things. The fact that what makes them possible, what preserves the city and these other virtues once it's there. So again, injustice therefore would be people from the lower classes, the producers, the artisans and so on, trying to rule the city, trying to do the job of the ruler rather than their own job and so on. Okay, so now they've established the four major virtues in the city. We can sort of recap very quickly: wisdom, the knowledge and the good counsel of the leaders, the rulers, the guardians; courage, the ability of the warriors to preserve the lawful opinion about what is and what is not terrible, especially in pains, but also during pleasure; and moderation is the agreement among both the rulers and the ruled concerning who should rule. This gives the city, control over the pleasures and desires, makes it moderate as a city as a whole. But again, it's a kind of accord or agreement about who should rule. Justice, again, minding one's own business, doing one's own particular job and nothing else. So not trying to sort of meddle in other people's jobs. The craftsman doesn't try to become a warrior. The warrior doesn't try to rule. It's sort of everybody doing their own job and nothing else. Okay, so then they say, okay, so we've established this. This is justice in the city. Now Socrates says, well, now remember we did this so we could find it in the individual. So let's see if we can find justice in the individual in that way. If we can actually, if the parallel exists, if having found justice in the city, we can now find it in the individual. And the first thing Socrates says is, well, all of these definitions, or most of them really, several of them were based on these three parts of the city. And so he says, is there that parallel? Are there three parts of the soul that somehow parallel or correspond to these three parts of the city? And so he says, this is the first thing that they have to sort of debate and figure out. And Socrates says, well, they might be a little imprecise or take a shortcut, but he says we'll do what's worthy of the rest of the argument. But he basically suggests that, yes, there are three parts. There's the reasoning part, what he sometimes calls calculation here. The spirited part, again, we've talked about that before. It first came up in book 2. And the desiring part. And he says, after all, these things are in the city: reason, spiritedness, the desires of everybody. He says, where do they come from if they're not in the individuals themselves? If everybody doesn't have them, how are they ending up in the city? Which makes some sense. And so he says, so there are these three parts. But then he goes off, and there's a kind of very long and somewhat detailed discussion about desire, and in particular, he's very focused on whether or not. As the note points out, he actually kind of introduces the principle of non-contradiction. He says it's impossible to desire and not desire something at the same time. But he spends a lot of time sort of considering different objections, different ways that you might object to that, almost as if he's anticipating Freud's ideas about ambivalence, that maybe it is possible to experience desire and aversion for the same thing at once. He sort of spends a lot of time trying to say, well, what about a spinning top that's moving and staying still at the same time? Is that possible? But eventually they sort of agree, yes, okay, you can't desire something and not desire it at the same time. But then he sort of establishes, okay, but maybe this was the real point of all of this, is he says, okay, but of course at times somebody might be thirsty and yet refuse to drink. For instance, if you're sick and you're very thirsty, but you think that drinking will make you even more sick. And so the doctor tells you don't drink. Even though you're very thirsty, drinking will just make it worse, so don't drink anything. And he says, that would be very difficult. So he says, so there is a time when you desire something, namely, when you're thirsty, when you desire to drink, and yet you don't drink. And he says, why does that happen? Isn't it, as he puts it, isn't that, calculation sort of telling you resisting the desire? As he says at 439c. Now, would we assert that sometimes there are some men who are thirsty but not willing to drink? Surely, he said, many and often. What should one say about them, I said? Isn't there something in their soul bidding them to drink and something forbidding them to do so? Something different that masters that which bids? So in other words, again, isn't there something desiring to drink and something, saying, no, you shouldn't drink? So as he puts it, bidding them to drink, desiring a drink, and forbidding it, saying no. He says, obviously, if they're not drinking, then it's the thing that's forbidding them to drink that is mastering, that is actually controlling what happens. In my opinion, there is, he said. Doesn't that which forbids such things come into being, when it comes into being, from calculation, while what leads and draws is present due to affections and diseases? It looks like it. So we won't be irrational, I said, if we claim they are two and different from each other, naming the part of the soul with which it calculates the calculating, and the part with which it loves, hungers, thirsts, and is agitated by the other desires, the irrational and desiring, companion of certain replenishments and pleasures. So he says, here's an example. As he's trying to sort of spell it out, he says, there's a calculating part of the soul, and that's separate from the desires. And we can see that because sometimes you desire something, and yet reason or calculation tells you it wouldn't be a good idea, so you resist that. You resist that desire. So he says, so these are clearly two different parts of the soul. And then he says, and what would we say about spiritedness at 439e? He says, well, and what about spiritedness? Is that one of these other types, or is that different? And Glaucon initially says, well, maybe it's one of the desires. Maybe it's part of the desiring part of the soul. And you can understand why. I mean, spiritedness, again, we talk, it can manifest itself in different ways, as anger, as shame, as a sense of loyalty. But all of these things are kind of irrational. They're more emotions than they are actual sort of rational thoughts. They may have thoughts going along with them, but they're ultimately, primarily maybe they're more something that you feel or that you experience emotionally rather than simply a rational idea. And of course, spiritedness might be a desire for vengeance. If you feel like you've been harmed and you want to fight back, then that's obviously a desire. So it's easy to understand why Glaucon suggests this. Maybe spiritedness is one of the desires. But Socrates sort of disagrees, and he tells this story of Leontius. And we'll read that really quickly. Socrates, but I said, I once heard something that I trust. Leontius, the son of Aglaion, was going up from the Piraeus under the outside of the north wall when he noticed corpses lying by the public executioner. He desired to look, but at the same time he was disgusted and made himself turn away. And for a while he struggled and covered his face. But finally, overpowered by the desire, he opened his eyes wide, ran towards the corpses, and said, "Look, you damned wretches, take your fill of the fair sight." I too have heard it, he said. So this was apparently a story that was going around ancient Athens for some reason. But so Socrates says, look, this is proof, right? Here's a desire. He has this desire to look, to see the corpses for whatever reason. I mean, there are many reasons why he may have wanted to look. But for some reason or another, he thought it was disgusting. He thought it was, and it's kind of unclear. Did he think it was shameful, that there was something ghoulish about what he was doing? Or did he just think it was disgusting and he just thought it would be, he was curious, and yet he thought that the disgust and maybe the horror and so on that he would feel wasn't worth satisfying his curiosity. But one way or the other, Socrates says, look, this is an example of how clearly he desired one thing, he wanted to look, and yet his spiritedness was against that, and he ultimately got angry at himself. So Socrates says, so this is a clear indication that spiritedness is not always the same as the desires. In this case, where he gave into a desire, he then got angry at himself for doing it. He sort of, blamed himself, blamed his eyes in this case, but, sort of blamed himself, denounced himself for it. So Socrates says, see, this is a clear proof that spiritedness is different from the desires. Now, of course, you might just say, well, no, spiritedness is still a desire. It doesn't necessarily go along with all of the other desires. In this case, again, there's some kind of a tension between his desire to look and his spiritedness. Again, whether it was that he didn't want to be disgusted or he thought it was shameful to want to gawk at these corpses, one way or the other, of course, you could say, well, that doesn't necessarily show that spiritedness isn't just one of the desires. I mean, you might be tired and hungry at the same time and just decide to go to sleep. It doesn't mean that hunger isn't one of the desires. It just means that it might contradict other desires. Socrates goes even further and seems to suggest that, he says, now you've never heard of a case when spiritedness is not an ally of speech, or when it goes with the desires against reason. Now here he specifically says that it allies itself with desires and goes against reason. This is, again, you could sort of debate this. You could say, well, is that true? I mean, don't people oftentimes want something, and if they don't get that, they get angry? Even if reason tells them you're being unreasonable, if one of their desires has been thwarted or disappointed in some way, don't they oftentimes get angry, get indignant, even though, again, reason tells them this is unreasonable? Because their desire has been not satisfied, they get angry. So you could certainly question the picture he's giving here, the presentation he's giving of spiritedness. And then shortly thereafter, he goes back to this quote from Homer, and he says, he's an example where Homer said, quotes somebody and says, he's sort of reproaching himself and saying, endure hard, don't get upset about this. And he says that's an example then that spiritedness is not simply part of reason, because here it was the calculating part decided that something was actually much, so again, somebody was experiencing some sort of distress, and they were getting upset about it, and the reason told them, endure, don't get so upset about this, you've been through worse, you're exaggerating, etc. So he says, so that's a sign that calculation or the reasoning part is not simply the same as the desiring part, or is not simply the same as the spirited part. He says, here's a case where reason was basically reproaching spiritedness or reproaching the heart. So he says, so therefore reason and spiritedness are not simply the same. So again, there may be questions about this, but in any case, the way that he presents it, there are three distinct parts of the soul: reason, spiritedness, and the desires. And so therefore, when he comes to explain what are these four cardinal virtues in an individual, he says courage is the spirited part of the individual preserving through pains and pleasures, as he puts it, what has been proclaimed by the speeches, so no longer the lawgiver, but the speeches, reason about that which is terrible and that which is not. He says it's at 442 B to C. Wisdom is the rule of, as he puts it, that little part which rules on the basis of knowledge, of what is, as he puts it, beneficial for each part and for the whole composed of the community of these three parts. So he says wisdom is, again, the smallest part, the smallest part of the soul. He says it's a little part, wisdom, reason. But he says, wisdom rules on the basis of knowledge, as he puts it, of what is beneficial for each part. So, wisdom is not just ruling for its own sake. It's ruling on the basis of knowledge of what's beneficial for each part. And as he puts it, the whole composed of the community of these three parts. So his wisdom knows what's best for each individual part and knows what's best for the individual as a whole, the community of these three parts. He says, that's wisdom, the rule of that part which knows those things and rules on the basis of of that knowledge. Moderation, again, the friendship and the accord of these parts, the agreement of all three that the calculating part should rule. So just like in the city, moderation was a kind of harmony among the different classes, that they all agreed that the rulers should rule, and they all submitted to the judgment and the rule of the guardians who were ruling on the basis of knowledge. He says in the soul it's the same thing. Moderation is the friendship, the accord, the harmony of these parts, in again, agreeing to or submitting to the rule of reason. And he says justice is each part doing its own job, not trying to do that of the others. So spiritedness obeys the reason. It doesn't try to rule on its own. And it obeys the reason and kind of controls the other desires, or the desires which, again, he presents as separate from spiritedness. So, again, if you are sick and you're very thirsty and you know that drinking water will only make you more sick, maybe eventually the intense desire to drink becomes strong, and so maybe you know, spiritedness, you know, you get angry at yourself, you know, rather than just sitting back and saying, well, I know that will make me worse, will make me less healthy, and so on, and just listening to the calculating part, maybe eventually spiritedness needs to take over, and you know, it needs to sort of, you need to kind of shame yourself into doing what reason tells you is best. So that's sort of how they end up then, and again, justice then turns out to be a certain harmony of the soul, each part doing its own proper job, not trying to do the parts of the others. And again, you can see one of the great advantages of this definition of justice is that all through the book so far, maybe not all through, but throughout much of the book, especially books 1 and 2, the great concern was which is better, justice or injustice? Is justice good? Obviously part of the concern was, well, what is justice? But with Thrasymachus and then with Glaucon, the question became, is justice good? Which is better, justice or injustice? And of course, the analogy that comes up throughout the Republic between spiritual or psychological health and physical health, so that, you know, justice is like physical health, injustice is like physical sickness. This comes up again and again, and obviously you can say, well, no one makes arguments saying that sickness is better than health. No one tries to argue that. And yet people like Thrasymachus, like Glaucon, can present arguments that injustice is actually better than justice. And how is that the case? Why is that the case? If justice really is good, if justice really is better than injustice, how can it be that people would argue that injustice is better? Again, no one argues that sickness is better than health, because it's clear that health is better than sickness. If justice is good in the same way, how does it happen that anybody ever argues that injustice is better? And of course, Socrates might come back and say, well, no one argues that sickness is better than health, but many people make smaller individual decisions that make them sick rather than healthy. So they may not actually say it's better to be sick than to be healthy, but they make all kinds of choices which they more or less know will harm their health, and they end up being sick, being unhealthy, being, you know, weak, whatever it is, because of choices that they make, because they choose these decisions, they choose these things, you know, to indulge these pleasures and so on, which will actually make them unhealthy. And he says, you know, injustice is sort of the same way. You can make decisions that make you unjust, and yet it's less clear, it's less obvious in the case of the soul than it is of the body that health, that justice is clearly better than injustice. But the great advantage of this definition of justice, or one of them maybe, is that again, it explains how people might choose injustice over justice. It explains why, if justice is really good, people might think that injustice is better, why they might choose injustice. If one of the desires rules in the soul, if greed or a desire for sensual pleasure rules in the soul, then people might make all kinds of unjust decisions because, again, the wrong part of the soul is ruling. Reason can see what is right and wrong, but it's not reason that's making the decision. People have given themselves over to a love of pleasure or a love of money, and therefore they're doing things that are clearly unjust, and they even think that that's better because, again, the wrong part of the soul is ruling. If spiritedness is too powerful in the soul, and people go out and commit acts of revenge that reason tells them are not just, that they're overreacting, that they're being unreasonable, that what they're doing with these acts of vengeance is actually unjust. Again, reason tells them that, but they're not making their decisions based on reason. They're making their decisions based on spiritedness. And so again, therefore, they choose injustice, and injustice even seems better to them because, again, the wrong part of the soul is ruling, is making the decisions, is sort of really what dominates in this individual, and therefore, you know, colors how they see the world. Reason is still there, but if it's not ruling, then they just see everything kind of wrong or incorrectly. So that's book 4 sort of ends there. I mean, there's a little bit of extra material, but essentially that's what they end, and then then they finally get to the idea. They finally define justice, and again, it's a certain harmony of the soul, each part of the soul performing the act or the work for which it's naturally suited, and not trying to do the work of the other parts.